Hey guys, welcome to. In this tutorial we're gonna have a look at transitions. Transition came with CSS 3 and you can do some really nice things with them. However, just point out before we get too into it, you do want to consider performance when you work with transitions. So don't go all crazy, and of course you also want to consider the UI perspective of it. So you don't want to go all crazy and make your website basically flash in multiple colors and move everywhere, because it's gonna be a horrendous experience for your user. Just one more thing before we get started here. If you haven't already done it, please hit the subscribe button down in the corner there, and you help me help you. Enough about that, let's jump into it. So let's just cover what we're going to go over in this tutorial. So we're going to be looking at transitions. So that's two concepts in CSS3 and how you can animate things. So we're going to discuss that a bit, and we're going to be looking at how to do transitions, and we're going to be looking at how to do it with JavaScript. You might already be familiar with JavaScript, and yet you can create some animations with it. However, there's some performance issues there as well, but this tutorial is going to be focused on how we can do this sort of thing with CSS and how we can take advantage of the CSS classes we built through JavaScript. The two concepts that come with CSS 3 for animating things is called transitions and animation. So transitions, as we're going to be focused on here, I'm not going to go too much over right now, but I'm just going to mention what the animation part is. If you are familiar with video editing at all, you'll be familiar with the concept of keyframes. You probably might have heard it from somewhere else as well. But the concept is basically you have some frames and you use that frame as a point, and then you can create a transition in between those, or a smooth effect, or whatever. You can do things in between keyframes. So you're choosing a couple of keyframes and you can do something in between these keyframes. And that's sort of the concept of how the animation works. So what is a transition? Well, a transition is essentially a change between two states. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you have a look at this illustration, you will notice we've got two A's, and that's the same object. However, you can notice that we've got a square on the first one and we've got a circle on the other one. So that's two different states. So you can imagine it to be a button, and once we hover this button, if you have a pseudo class of hover on it, then that square changes to a circle, and in between these two we then have a transition. So if you didn't have a transition, it would just change from square to circle. However, we can do this smoothly and gradually kind of create the circle from the square, and just basically give it a nice effect. In order to create a transition with CSS, we need to create a transition on that element that we want the transitions to happen on. So what I mean by that is that you don't want to put the transition property onto your pseudo class. So you don't want to put it on your hover or active or whatever the change. You want to put it on the actual element. So if you see here, in our initial state with A, where this is a square, that's where we're going to put our transition property. So there's a shorthand, there's a longhand, and we're going to go into that in a minute here. But just remember, you always put it on that. The other thing we're going to need is some sort of transformative property. So you want a change between these two, otherwise we're not going to have anything to transition. So while it's not correct to call it transform, well, it could be transform, it could be some sort of rotation or something like that. It can be a lot of things. I'm going to give you a list over all the things you can actually transition. So you want to put that on your pseudo class. However, what is not in this illustration is that you also need to have it defined on your initial or your actual element. So you're going to see in a minute here why you have to do that, because your transition is basically going to break if you don't have that initial state. So if it doesn't know what to change from, it's not going to be able to create this transition. So if you haven't defined where your element is, it's not going to know where to move it from. So if I wanted to move it from top, I would have to define top on that square here, and then I would define top on this one as well, but then I would change in maybe 50 pixels or wherever I want to move that, and then I can create that transition between these two. Just one more slide before we get on to the fun bit. Let's just talk about this transition property. So what we have here is the shorthand, so you can do the longhand. I'm going to show you both, but let's just discuss what we're going to need in this transition. So you define your transition, as said, on that element. But what we're going to put on here, well, the first property is the transition property. So that can be all, or it can be top, or whichever specific one you might want to transition. So say if I only want to change a border, I can then put border in there. But if I have several different ones, like I want to have background, I want to have a border, I want to, etc., etc., basically, then you can put all and it's take them all. So The next one is the duration. So the duration is how long is this transition gonna take. So it could take 1 second, it could take 100 milliseconds or something like that. So that is basically the period it's gonna take. So if you have that square we're talking about before, it's gonna take, in this case, 100 milliseconds for it to change to a circle from a square. The next thing we need to define is your timing function, and in this case we got the ease. So we're gonna go over the different functions available to you in a bit, but it's basically how are your transition gonna occur. Is it gonna start out quickly? Is it gonna start out slowly and go quickly, or is it just gonna be a linear? So the last thing we got here is just the delay one, and that's an optional one. You only need the transition property, which I've defined as property here, and the duration, which is your transition duration, and your timing function, which is your transition timing function if you're going to do with longhand. So the delay is optional, as I said, but what the delay does is it's sort of like a delay when you want your transition to happen. So if you had a pseudo class of hover and I moved my mouse over and I had put it as 1 second here, the transition would happen or occur in 1 second. So nothing will happen until that second has passed. And you're going to see how this actually is quite neat in some ways, because you can start playing with different transition effects and have them occur at different points. Alright guys, so let's get on with the fun stuff here. So I'm in CodePen here, and I'm going to be using Jade and Sass. So if you're not familiar with Jade or Sass, don't worry, I'm going to be showing you the compiled CSS and HTML as well, and I'm also going to be explaining to you what is actually going on here, so hopefully you should be able to follow along. I will also make this CodePen available to you, so you can go in and play with it yourself if you want. So let's jump into it. In our HTML here, we got one called dot container, sorry, and then we got dot one, and then we got p1 here. So what this is, it basically says that this is a div with a class of container, and then we got another div in here with a class of 1, and then we got a paragraph in here with a number 1. So I can show you the compiled here. So there you have it. So that's pretty much what that means, and how that works is that it's basically just indented and you create HTML elements from that. So don't worry about that. You saw the animation ran over here, so let's just jump into the CSS what's actually going on here. So I started out creating a basic one, and in here in our Sass we then got a hover, so that's a hover here, and then down here we got some basic styles defined on the divs inside our container, so that's the one here. So it's basically just defining the divs to be squares with a bit of a border around, and then we got some margin and padding. What is also worth noting here is that we have position relative, because we're going to be using top, you see down here, to move things around. So if you're going to be doing things like that, you need to set the right position. Another thing worth mentioning once we start talking about this transition, is not everything you can transition, so you won't be able to transition something like your position from relative to absolute or something like that, and you won't be able to transition a font change. So the ones you can transition, you probably will be able to work out yourself, but I will make a list available to you. And then down here at the bottom we then got the styles for the actual div 1 here. So what we're saying is we were putting a transition on it, and then we wanted to start at 0, top 0. So as you said before, you need to put the transition on the element you want to transition and not up here. You see we got transform and top, and that's the things we want to change. So down here in our transition, I mentioned earlier that we could say all, so we would change all these things. Then here we got 1, that's our duration, and then we have ease in and ease out. So it's gonna ease in as it goes, and then it's gonna ease out as it gets close to the end of it. So if I go in here, we have this effect. So we're basically moving between those points, and then we're rotating it 360 degrees between those points. So just to show you compiled CSS here. So we're basically just putting a hover on here, and then we're targeting that one div there, div 1, class 1. And then down here we don't have anything for container, but we are getting the divs here and giving the stars, and then down here we're putting the transition effects on, as I said. Another thing worth mentioning is transitions. At the moment, they're sort of, at this point of this tutorial, they are pretty standard now. So most of the modern support, if not all actually, is supporting them. However, you're going to target some other old browsers if we're using the different prefixes. And the best thing probably way to do that would using auto prefixer. So in this case, I'm running auto prefixer. So if I've gone up here, I can then go into my CSS here, and I've got auto prefixer on here. And what that does is it basically handles all these different browser issues with things that's not supported, and we get a WebKit in front of that. So that was a pretty basic example, but let's talk about the duration here. So I added another div up here with a class of 2 and a paragraph in there with 2 in it, and we now got 2 squares here. And down here I've added this. It's got a new hover, so it's exactly the same as that one pretty much. We got 2. We're targeting the pseudo class there on number 2, and then down here we just get the definition and the transition on that element. So what's going on here? Well, what's different from the other one is that we have made the duration 3 seconds here, and I'm gonna not have just to make a comparison between them. So now it's still gonna be doing the 360 degrees and gonna move 300 pixels down, but it's gonna happen over a duration of 3 seconds. So let's just see how that works. So 1, 2, 3. There we are. And if I move it again, the one takes 1 second out there, and the other one makes the effect over 3 seconds. So that's how duration works. So before we go any further, let's just talk about the transition property. So I mentioned that we're going to be using all on these to get all the effects, but what if I only want to move the top and I didn't want to rotate it? What I could do, instead of saying all here, I could say top, and you should see that it should only do the top now, and there you have it. So it's no longer rotating. So that's 2 of the things we need to define. The last thing we need to define to make a transition work is our timing function, and in the other ones we've been using ease. So let's just talk about the timing functions here. A timing function, as I said earlier, is sort of like the way your transition is going to occur. So in here you see we have ease, linear, ease in, ease out, and so on. And if you look at the ease in, you see it starts out slowly here and then it builds up in the end. And then we've got ease out, so it starts quickly here and then it sort of eases out at the end. And then we've got the ease in and out, which is probably one of the best ones to use. I personally find that's very nice. So it slowly starts out and it goes quicker and then it eases out at the end. So we also got one called QBCA, which we're going to be having a look at later, and that allows you to define certain points and make your own curves. And yeah, try the different ones out, play around with them and get a feel for which one is suitable for your project. So we are back here in a code editor and we have added a new div. So it has the div with the class 3 and we have a paragraph again exactly the same before with a digit of 3 inside it. Also down here where we also added is a new pseudo class for that number 3 there. So we have hover, every time we hover its HTML element we got class 3 changing position. So changing 300 pixels only here, and down here as always we want to put the transition onto that class 3 here. So you see we're just targeting top here and 1 second duration and then ease in, ease out, and then after 500 milliseconds this transition gonna occur. And then we, as said before, we want top 0, otherwise we won't get the transition. So let's hover over here and see what happens. If you notice there was a bit delayed, the other one start moving and then that moves. So if I went in here and instead of milliseconds I gave that 2 seconds, we should see a big change here. Give it a top, there, look at. We move out again. So that's how the delay works. Just to point out why I keep saying that you need to sort of define this on it. If I was to remove top here, you notice this. So now it doesn't know the original state of it, and we're not going to get the transition effect. So if you have something like with your transition not picking up, it's probably because you forgot to define the initial one. So let's go back there, and we should have it working again. There we go. So I'll just turn that back to 500 milliseconds here. So hopefully by now you're kind of getting the main concept of it. So let's try to combine these things a bit. So up here we now got a new div with a class of 4, and then down here in the pseudo classes here we now are defining the background color, the top, the border radius because we want a circle now, and the opacity. And as before down here we then want to say all these effects or properties need to be affected, and we're going to take 1 second and we're going to do that over linear progression. And as was before, we need to define the different ones here just to make it work. So if I go over here, you now see all these effects working together. And what I'm trying to show you here is that obviously you're going to be doing something different. You're not going to be creating squares. You're probably going to be creating photo effects when you hover on it, or you're going to be creating a loader. You might want to load the content in and say you're waiting on it, then it's gradually loading in with the opacity changing or square changing or something like that. Or you have some text coming out of nowhere. Maybe you have some text coming in from the side, or you have the text changing opacity or getting different size or something like that. Alright, at this point you're probably getting tired of looking at squares, but here's another one. We made it one for 5, and let's just try, as I said, to combine these. So we got all the different colors changing and the board and so on, but what if you want to affect each individual transition property? So if I want to change the background color in a different way that I want to change the position, so I might want a delay on that or something like that. So let's look at how to do that, and I might just surprise you and not give you more squares. Don't be too surprised. So down here, as I got there before, we got a new div with a class, but down here in a pseudo class under 5 here, we now got the top position, and we now want to change it to left, and we want to change the background color and the color of the text. But we want this to occur at a different time, so I would like it to go to the side, and then I want an effect to take place, and then I want to then move it down. So if we go down here, here is your long hand way of doing it. So we've been using that it's a shorthand. So we can define our transition property. So top, left, background, that's the ones, or you could be all. But since we want to target the different ones here, we want to do it like this way, because we can say top, and then down in duration we have 1 second. So that matches up to top. And then down here in delay we've got 1 second. So that matches up to the top. And then we've got a left up here that matches to the 200 milliseconds down there, and 0 seconds down in delay, and you get the concept. You can add a lot here, and you basically just build on that. And in the end here as well, we got the timing functions, and the same concept. You can change these different timing functions depending on how you want each of these different properties to be affected. So as always, we want to define just the top on the left the properties we're going to be using. So if I move it over here, we get this effect. So you will see that we want to move it left over 200 seconds, but we want that left to start straight away, and we want the delay on the top, so it's not going to start moving down until after 1 second. So move to the side, and then we want to change the background color, so it happens over 1 second here, but it doesn't start until 200 milliseconds. So you sort of get this effect. We go to the side and we change the color, and then we move down. So if I had made these all the same, we would we would have gone from top to left in kind of diagonal way like that, instead of going to that side, changing the color and going on. You'll also notice when we're doing this how it works on the way back. So if you have left, it's gonna go right and then up to get back, but we're gonna play the same transition effect like that. Believe it or not, we got a circle, guys. It's actually a circle, it's not a square. So as before, we got a class of 6 here now, and we got 6 inside it, and up here we then got, find a pseudo class here, we just want to move from the top and move down 300 pixel, and down here we want to work with cubic base EA. So before I mentioned cubic base EA as one of your timing functions, and it allows you to create your own curves on how the transition should happen. So if I move over here, you will notice it's sort of like it goes quickly like that, and then it falls down, so like that. So sort of like a ball jumping, but it's not obviously not as smoothly done as it should be if you're gonna create that sort of effect. But it's just to create the concept. If you're really hardcore, you can learn how to work with these numbers. However, I don't want to spend time on it. So there's sites available to you. So if you go to Cubic Base A, you can go in here and create your own vector curve here. And you notice the number changing up here, and you can save it, and you can basically paste it in there. Also, another way to do it, if you are in Chrome, you can basically inspect it, and then if you find the element with the transition on, you will notice this little purple icon here. If you click on that, Chrome allows you to change that curve as well, and then our effect is definitely there. So just before I'm going to show you the last thing here, I just want to mention something about performance here. You want to try to keep it over at least 30 frames per second, otherwise the user is going to be able to notice it. Ideally you will have it at 60 frames per second, but depending on what you're doing, if you're just doing some sort of image effect, if you're not doing anything really heavy, you'll probably get away with quite a lot. However, there are some properties that's performing a lot better than other ones. So if you're going to choose something like precision, or your scale, or your opacity, those are some of the ones which are performing well. So last thing I want to show you is how to use these CSS styles or classes with JavaScript. So you could do the whole animation with JavaScript, but we're going to take advantage of the styles we already defined. So I created yet another square here at the end, number 7, but the square is actually a button, as you see up here. So it's a button, and the text inside that button is just 7. What I also done in here in my classes in here is I added the button, so you just get the basic styles there, and then down here, find button down here, I just did a bit of extra stuff here, just basically setting the width because it's slightly different because of it not being a div. And then down here we have our transition again, and we need that on because we want to target that button now through JavaScript. So you want to transition on that button, and then we want to apply a class to that button. So how do we do that? Well, down here we have our typical jQuery. So just your wrapper there that when it runs to start, when the page is loaded, we want to do this. And then you got your button, so we select a button here, and then we're going to bind a click event to that button. And then a button here, we're using this to get that button. We then want to toggle a class active. So our class active is here. And what we want to do is we want to move the position slightly up, and then we want to change the shadow on it. So we've got a box shadow on here, but we want to give it sort of giving that sort of hover effect. So when I click on this now, you should see that happening. So there you are. So it will now be applying that active class, and you can see it happening with a transition. And that's because we defined the transition effect on here. So if I was to change this to 2000 like here now, you see this transition being a lot slower. So you see you have that effect on it. So we basically are able to apply a class and change the properties as long as you have that transition on your element. So that's pretty neat. So what else can we do? Well, we can talk classes, but you can do a lot of other things. We could, for example, do something like this. So we can use the CSS, and we could define a border color on another element. So we already got the property of border on this one. So when I click this one, we should be able to change the border color, and there we have it. And you notice that happened with a transition effect as well, because we defined that transition all on this up here. Where was it? Second, find it. See that? So all the effects applied to this is gonna have this sort of ease in and out effect happen to it when I click that button. So that's everything on transition, guys. I hope it gave you a good picture of how to work with transitions, and hopefully you learned enough on this to actually start combining these things. One thing also to take away from this is I haven't really explained, but you might have worked out by now, is how do I work with different transitions at the same time. Well, you notice that all this stuff up here is defined on our on our HTML tag up here. Just find it. See all these effects. So what you can do is you can create a button or a link, for example, if you have a hyperlink, and you can then create different elements in you might have a span or something, and you can then target that specific span and have a different hover effect on it when you click your link, like we have all our hover effects on our HTML here and affecting them differently. So hopefully that makes sense, guys, and I hope you got something out of this tutorial. As I said, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.